I have this is right up your alley here. The Miles Quaritch. He's the bad guy in Avatar.
Jay, let me give you this quote. If you guys know Avatar, a marine in an avatar body, that's a potent mix. Now we're gonna give it to Fukuyama. A common law backed up by an effectively centralized state, that's a potent mix.
That's a potent mix.
Welcome to the Books Brothers podcast. We synthesize, summarize, and discuss the most important books in history, science, and philosophy. We are on a journey to explore the world through my personal favorite medium, books. I'm JD.
I'm Andrew, and on today's episode, we're covering Francis Fukuyama's sweeping exploration of how human societies evolved from tribes to modern states in his 2011 book, The Origins of Political Order. Dude, we got ourselves Francis Fukuyama.
Nice.
Dude, look at this bad boy, baby. Look at that thing.
Thick.
That ain't small. And dude, look at this text. If you're on YouTube watching this, look at this freaking text, dude.
Yeah.
It is tiny, okay? It took a
it's a
long
pretty big
time to
book.
read this book, okay? Carol, I told her we were going to record this book, Origins of Political Order, and she was like, what is it about? And I was like, the origins of governments.
Yeah.
And she's like, all right, where did all the governments come from? You know? And I was like, well, I don't know. And she's
I
like,
think
"You
it's
read
on
the whole book?"
page 415 something.
Yeah, and so I was trying to way oversimplify the answer, and I was like trying to play around with the entire book and like make it, like a one-sentence answer, which I'm sure Fukuyama would love, his book reduced to one. But I think my answer is, where do governments come from? Military and religion. Military and religion. That's where governments come from. And like the sort of the intertwining, religious, military kind of back and forth over time, getting bigger and bigger, seems to be like sort of the story of this book. Would you agree? That's a pretty hot take to lead off with here.
Yeah, I do think that's kind of a decent sum up. There's a famous book called Wealth and Poverty of Nations, is what it's called. But it basically breaks down wealth and poverty of nations into like cultural differences between nations, geographic differences, and institutional differences, which institutions is another big word from recent Nobel winning Why Nations Fail, is all about institutions and stuff. But the reason I'm bringing that up is because culture, the differences between culture and why European culture seemed to colonize the rest of the world, is answered in our upcoming book, The Weirdest People in the World, How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar. The geography of nations was pretty well covered by Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond, which we did. And then this book is focusing on the differences in political institutions and specifically why some countries have stable political institutions. So the answer to why do political institutions exist in the first place, military and religion, does seem to sum it up.
He's kind of asking the question like, why are some countries better than others? Like, why are some governments better than others? Like, some governments have a very high percentage of poor people, and you can evaluate governments in a million different ways, but he's trying to, like, walk you through the history of all of the major governments and then, like, point out the differences in how they were created, determine, the way they are today. And so he's got a codification of good governments, 3 categories that you need to check the box to have good government, Jay.
State capacity. Can your state actually do stuff like defend your borders, collect taxes efficiently, train a bureaucracy? And is your state modern, aka not an extended kin group ruling over other kin groups, but rather an impersonal bureaucracy? His question isn't how did a state arise, because kin groups have been ruling and controlling territory way back into our history, but how did impersonal states arise? And that's where he focuses on China, which is great, because I've also focused on China in my reading. China's been firing on all cylinders as far as impersonal bureaucracy since the 200s BC. And the rise of European states is really like the 1500s in terms of a modern sense. So like almost 2,000 years, China has them.
And what JD's walking through here, so that's the first of his 3 sort of like check boxes for a successful government, state capacity. The book is really crazy because it goes state capacity, rule of law, accountable government. Those are the 3 check boxes. But he kind of walks you through the countries as he walks you through the check boxes of those 3, capacity, rule of law, and government. And so it's like a double layered walkthrough. You're getting country stories and like sort of like purpose doc.
It is a little hard to follow, so that's why it's good that we're breaking it down so much in the beginning. He's going to walk you through the history of different states developing state capacity. Then the second of the three political category of political institutions is rule of law. Does the state uphold norms of justice of the wider community? And the bigger point is that the norms and the laws are above the state. Like the state is taking care of laws that they are subordinate to or that existed before them. Ideally that the state didn't even make, because if an emperor can flout the law, that's not in Fukuyama's definition, not the rule of law. So the main difference there being China never quite developed the rule of law because the state has always been the final word on whatever it's wanted to do.
Right. And specifically when you talk about rule of law, usually it ends up one guy doesn't have rule of law apply to him, usually the king, emperor, whatever, right? So
which wouldn't be rule of law. And so, you know,
correct.
The difference being Western Europe somehow did develop a rule of law that the emperor or king was governed underneath. And then the final category is accountable government. Does the government try its best to help the people being governed? You want to hit us with the first accountable government? Truly accountable government.
Dude, little throw it out there. We're going to get back to English and English Parliament in a second, but that was the first truly accountable government after the Glorious Revolution in England. Parliament represented the richest 10% of people, so we're not all the way there, but we got a little way there. But that was obviously vastly more than any government had more number of people than any government had represented before. So those are the three rules of creating a good government. Before you create the good government, he says it kind of in the beginning and rehashing it he's like, if you go way, way back, pre-governments, pre-writing, pre-everything, we're going back into our ancient city podcast a little bit. He was like, you started with tribes that were dependent on your family. Right. And he has this really, JD mentioned kin groups. That's a funny way to say family, right? It's like sort of the wider family that these ancient humans kind of grew up with, right? And he points out that the government, the modern state is really attack on the family because he's like, for generations leading up till China in 200 BC, everything was about having the same ancestors. You're in the same family, your cousins, your second cousins, your everything. That's sort of your kin group is your family.
And that's the only way to organize people is to be organized by family, because otherwise, why would I do anything for you, you know? And so the only organization method was
kin groups. And now the modern state is an attack on the family, attack on the kin groups. But obviously it makes sense because kin groups can only get so big. Military necessity dictated that you need to get a little bit bigger, right? And that was how about this one, Jay? The Qin dynasty won control of China in 221 BC, right? So it's like, where do you think China came from, right? The Qin dynasty really was the one that obviously still a kin group, the Qin dynasty, but big enough, had a strong enough military to like take out. And I believe they're the ones we'll probably get into China a little bit more. So he's got this really nice framework, Fukuyama does. Bands, which are like tiny little family groups, to tribes, which are like bigger kin groups, to societies, you know, and he goes, bands, we all believe in mutual ancestors. You know, once your mutual ancestors sort of pool gets big enough, you start to create, you're not a band anymore, you're a tribe, and your tribe keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you start to set some rules down, and we have to compete with other tribes militarily, and you keep getting bigger and bigger, and now you become a society. What this book is about is how those three rules create the best governments. You know, accountable government, rule of law, and whatever the third one is that I can't think of off the cuff.
State capacity.
State capacity is the first one. So
that brings us right to part one, before the state. Chapter 1, the necessity of politics, and I had to look it up because, you know, that's such a vague word. Here's the definition, quote, the activities associated with governance or of a country or other area, especially the debate or conflict among individuals or parties having or hoping to achieve power. We cover a lot in Against the Grain, so we're going to breeze through this chapter. I also define institutions because that's another kind of vague word. A society or organization founded for a religious, educational, or similar purpose, or an established law, practice, or custom. We're kind of rehashing the very beginning that political institutions are the things that last through time, and the three that good political institutions balance is power or state capacity, rule of law, accountability.
Can't hammer those home enough. The whole book. It's part 1, 2, 3, right? So any state we talk about has power or state capacity as a given. So part 1 and part 2 of the book are the stories of the rise of powerful governments, you know?
Yeah, which is basically state capacity, so.
The ones with state capacity, China, India, Europe, America, etc. So it's the stories of how all these powerful governments achieve their state capacity. It reads like a history of the political processes that led to the current powerful governments of today. The need to balance rule of law is part 3. So part 1, part 2 is like, hey, state capacity, the rise of powerful governments.
Yeah.
Rule of law, part 3. Accountability, part 4. Quote, political institutions are necessary and cannot be taken for granted. A market economy and high levels of wealth don't magically appear when you get government out of the way. They rest on a hidden institutional foundation of property rights, rule of law, and basic political order.
Boom. He starts with China, because obviously China has had the unbroken chain of government and language and writing and I mean, it's like, imagine if we were still Rome. We were Romans, we were speaking Latin, and, we were talking about all the gods. That's what it's like for China, is they've been Rome for 2,000 years. It's unbelievable.
Dude, it's crazy to think if we were like looking back, presidents of like the 300s BC. Like, that's what China can do. That's crazy.
100%.
Right?
Yeah. Dynasty. Yeah. They're speaking the same language. They could read everything that was written. Pick up a piece of paper. You can read it mostly. It's unbelievable. I mean, and I love reading about especially the Song Dynasty, which is about 1000 AD. They've got paper money. They've got restaurants and art galleries and firefighters and gunpowder and police stations. And, it's just unbelievable how ahead, and like a lot of these books on progress studies, which is a good like overall term for these series of books that we're doing, Guns, Germs, and Steel and Weird, or like a lot of them say like any time up until 1600-ish, and you would peg China as taking over the world, and so why didn't they? And like in the early 1900s, they were a poor country. So what's going on there? It's kind of a bit of a tease that we were even talking about that, because we go back to the state of nature. So he goes back to how did we evolve? Where did the first things come from? Which you did in the intro, which is also relevant to one of our favorite books called Chimpanzee Politics, friend of the show, Franz de Waal. Political coalitions go back to chimp time, and it takes a lot of emotional intelligence, and you're building up a big brain to, be able to coordinate people's behavior and solve problems for people. And that's how you get authority to make decisions. He's setting up our basic pattern of sociability is to favor friends and relatives. Because that's how, if you want to be a powerful chimp, you favor your friends and relatives, they back you, whatever. And the only way to get a state that's able to organize enough people is to go against your kin selection, and you have to weaken the natural inclination for people to give family power.
So that's part 1, bands, tribes, societies. Gotta build that state capacity. We promised part 2, state building, Chinese tribalism. War and the rise of the Chinese state, the Yama thesis. We love our guy, Francis Fukuyama. The Yama thesis. China never had rule of law. Emperor always makes and is above the law. Why? JD's got a hot take.
China never had a transcendental religion. That's kind of the main point of the book, is that the Catholic Church is largely responsible for rule of law in Western Europe. And China never got much past ancestor worship. We've all seen Mulan. We know the ancestor worship. So how did China form the first bureaucratic state? And here's a good quote from Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. This is how China was able to form a state way back in 200 BC. Quote, "It makes no difference what men think of war," said the judge. "War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man, war waited for him. The ultimate trade waiting its ultimate practitioner. This is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way. War is God." Basically, war created the Chinese bureaucratic state, gradually phased out kinship as the basis for social organization, because you're not able to make war effectively if you're limited to your little kin group. So you either select the best leaders and soldiers to fight, or you die to people that did better than you did.
This period of the Chinese history. So this is the story of the creation of China, and they had a huge period called the Warring States period. Also, Confucius was in that period too. China, the area that now makes up China, started as a war between thousands of little polities, and then eventually, over hundreds of years, those little cities, we'll call them, turns into 7 states, and eventually one of those 7 states gets big enough and takes over the other ones and turns the entire China into one major empire. Mao Zedong had a favorite conquistador of China,
Qin Shi Huangdi in 221 is the first one to start the Empire of China. And there were other dynasties before and little statelets, but he was the one that dominated the whole continent. And that's where the word China comes from, is the dynasty started by him, Qin. And this is straight out of World Order. We talk about the monarch battles against an elite noble families. And Qin Shi Huangdi just destroys all the nobles because you can't allow regional tribal power bases in your continental empire. The other thing Mao loved about him is he killed academics and he buried, what is it? This is an actual Mao quote. Wow, this is crazy. Quote from Mao Zedong. He buried 460 scholars alive. We have buried 46,000. What a quote.
That was Mao, giving a shout out to Qin Shi Huangdi, 221
yeah, look out.
BC.
Yeah, you think he's
Whoa.
badass.
221 BC is the first major date that we bring up because it's Fukuyama's date of the founding of the Chinese Empire. That also is the founding of the first of the societies that are still around today. So China gets the first shout out. This 221 is the earliest date for states that still exist, extant states, you might call them. So
yeah, here's a quote. Much of China's subsequent history up through the communist victory can be understood in terms of the tensions between legalism and Confucianism, a tension that played a part around the appropriate role of the family in politics. So we mentioned Confucius in the Warring States, and he's kind of like a very hierarchical look, like you serve your parents and you serve the local state and then you serve the big state, where Qin dynasty was very focused on legalism, which is a little bit more communist too, which is just a series of laws and harsh punishments and incentivize everyone to do what we want them to do by billions of laws. For the Qin state, they actually implemented a bit too many laws, and we talked about this in a different podcast, but it's just such a good story. This guy was a megalomaniac, and he created, millions of laws and death for this, death for that. This is very relevant to his empire because he said if you show up late to a battle, all the people are put to death, all the generals and lieutenants and whatever, everybody's put to death. Well, one guy is headed to a battle, and then a crazy storm comes, and he can't go through a mountain pass because they got 10 feet of snow. And he's like, well, we're all going to die or we're going to revolt because that guy. So that was the end of the Qin Empire. And the Han left most of the rules in place, but kind of eased it up, brought Confucianism back. That started the Great Han system, which is where the bureaucratic state was really born. They ruled for 400 years. They systematized the bureaucracy with the famous civil service exams. Absolute genius move from China. And a big reason why it was a superpower for the next 2,000 years, because what they do is they take the important roles. One, they sift for IQ, smart people get the governing roles. But the even more important thing, interestingly, is to separate those powerful roles from their kin groups. It would be your natural inclination to give your powerful position and that salary to one of your children. Well, when that happens, all of a sudden you start paying off cousins and nephews and grandchildren, and it fucks up your governing system. And China got rid of that from the beginning. It's had fits and starts, I'm sure, but you have to get the family out. That's the whole point of this whole book.
They had a Confucian system. They got the civil service exams and the Han Dynasty. Talk about, early government. That's a recipe for lasting a long time 2,000 years ago, right? That'll work.
Yeah. And then, so that's the rise, and then there's inevitably a fall. And to quote, this is one of the famous opening lines from the major novel of all Chinese history. This is such a good little opening line. Quote, "The empire, long divided, must unite. Semicolon. Long united, must divide. Thus has it ever been." Such a good one.
Dude, that is a good one.
Because China's had many dynasties.
Yeah.
They always fall and they always come back together. And that brings me to a poem from China. This is 700 AD. But everybody knows this poem in China. They memorize it. It's a very short poem. So this guy was living at the end of one of the dynasties. And I mean, if you imagine your police force fails, what's going to happen? It turns into narco trafficker Mexico. There's just roving bandits who get to tell you what to do and what they want to take. The state just collapses and it's just horrible for everybody. The mortality just explodes. Here's his poem. "The state is destroyed, but the country remains. In the city in spring, grass and weeds grow everywhere. Grieving for the times, even the blossom sheds tears. Beacon fires have been burning for 3 months now. A letter from home would be worth 10,000 in gold." It's such a cool, like,
Dude, that's an intense
isn't
poem.
it? Yeah, especially the beacon fire, like nobody's answering. Everybody's in trouble. Nobody, there's no way to coordinate everybody. Everybody's dying from barbarians and disease and starvation. And, he's far away because he was in the civil service. And, I don't know how my family's doing. I would pay 10,000 in gold for any, but do you think they're delivering letters if the beacon fires are lit? Powerful stuff.
Dude, it's powerful stuff to think about how that would affect you if you're a Chinese citizen today. Like that's sort of your story. Like, we don't want that. I want my beacon fires to be called.
100%. That's a good point. And that's a huge plus of the Communist Party is just like, we are locked and loaded, we're not falling apart. Everything's locked down.
The beacon fires are being answered, like, dude, we got you, team, like, we might not totally got you how you love. You might not have all the freedom you wish you had.
Yeah.
But it ain't that barbarian shit.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's crazy. That's very cool poem. So we got a little bottom line here. It's the first modern state with impersonal institutions, civil service exam shout out. It definitely had state capacity because the militaries eventually fought until one took over. It also had accountability because we didn't really hit on this too hard, but that Han dynasty had accountability from the government from an ethics perspective. They had a Confucian ethos that was more like, hey, the emperor must serve the people. So at least the emperors had this idea in their head, but it didn't have actual rule of law.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a little baked into quasi-religious Confucianism. And so they had an inkling of it, but no rule of law is the main point. So now we move on to India.
India's story is fascinating. Pre-written word, right? They had some really unique society organizational systems, very different from China. It's the Varnas and the Jatis, also known as the caste system. Dude, this was like, I got lost in the India chapter a little bit because it was so completely different than anything that we've ever thought about before. So first I want to just quick hit you with the Varna system. They had like 4 layers to society. On the top are the priests, and this is a Hindu society. On the top are the priests, then second below the priests are the warriors, below the warriors are the merchants, and then below the merchants are everyone else, the peasants, the peasant class, right? Everyone knows clearly who's above them in society, depth chart. In a weird way, the priests are giving rule of law because the priests follow the religion, the priests follow the law, and the priests also are on top of the warriors. So that gives some sort of like control and state capacity, right? Because, there's like someone
so
there.
he does call it rule of law because the priests are higher ranked than the warriors. And where this all comes from is basically the Indo-European invaders. They're coming from Afghanistan and Iran. And they're bringing in those really old, the Vedas, really old religious texts. This is probably like 2,000-3,000 years ago. What do? They put themselves on top, and they've seen it in the DNA that the Brahmin caste has more Iranian, Central Asian sort of DNA than the people who have been there forever. I think the main point is that he calls it the India detour because India never quite developed the state capacity that China or Europe did. It comes together very briefly, but it's mostly been separated over the last few thousand years. India was never able to overcome the kin group gravity, the force of gravity,
Not just the kin group. What he's saying is they weren't able to overcome the caste system and the Varna system, which what it did is it created these like very strong local connections, similar to kin groups, but they never, even to this day, they still have the caste system. They still have this Varna belief in their religion. So
yeah, social order overcomes the civil order.
Yes.
They're never able to like impersonalize a bureaucracy. And the Brahmin is sort of a king group because they pass it down to their son over and over. It's kind of a social order that isn't able to be overcome.
This also relates to the caste system. So we're going to get into that. He calls it the Jati system, but I checked it out and I think they're interchangeable. I hope they are. And by the way, shout out. We have tons of listeners in India. We love you guys. So we hope we're probably screwing this whole India section up a lot, but we love you. And reach out to us and tell us how we screwed it up. But we are trying to do as best, faithful to the book as we can. The caste system, you're born and your life is already coded. Your father's a shoemaker. You're a shoemaker. Your son is going to be a shoemaker. That's it. And Fukuyama calls this great quote, the sacralization of the occupational order. And I actually screenshotted like half a paragraph from the book and put it in here because it was such an interesting, the closest thing I can think to these castes are they're kind of like unions in the United States. They're not, they're very different, but like if you squint, they kind of have some similarities. But listen to this. The only possibilities for social mobility existed not in this life, but between lifetimes. Since one, you can't change who you are once you're born, right? You're trapped in your karma, your caste for life. But whether you moved up or down the hierarchy of jatis, basically, whether you moved up in your next life was a reflection of how good you did in this life, right?
Mm-hmm. So serve the order well here. Don't make waves. Don't rock the boat. And you'll do better next time around. Just wait.
You'll get bumped up next time, dude. That's a long time to wait and just wait for the next life, dude.
I listened to a talk with him, and he makes an interesting point that he's like, you have to take the religious thoughts very seriously. And he's like, when you look at the Hindu metaphysics of like karma in this life changes your station in the next life, it makes a little bit more sense for why these occupations can be so rock solid for thousands of years. And I've mentioned the genetics. In one village, you can test people and you can tell their caste because they might not have any relatives in common with someone from a different caste going back 1,000 years or more, which is a society like unheard of in societies to be so constrained and have the mixing locked down so much. Like, just unbelievable what was going on there. And so I guess you have to take the religion really seriously and be like, that's how they thought.
Dude, Ancient City says the same thing. He's like, you can't divorce ancient man from his religion. Like his religion coded everything in his life, right? So
here's a good quote from him. If one wanted an example of a religion that justified the dominance of a single small elite over the rest of society, one would choose not Christianity or Islam, with their underlying messages of universal equality, but rather the Brahmanic religion that appeared in India in the last 2,000 years.
And Jay, just talking about these caste system, I just want to get into the story here. It's absolutely fascinating. So, yeah, the caste system codified in the religion. This is everyone's job. Nothing can change it. He makes a big point. He's like, you can't come up with a worse system to make the modern economy work, right? But he's like, listen to how detailed this is. So if you were born a shoemaker because your father was a shoemaker, your father's part of the shoemaker union, and there's other shoemakers in other towns all over the place. You guys are all friends. You all know each other, and like you're all part of the same group. This is how the groups interacted in India. So this is a real story. In Ahmedabad, a banker who was having his house re-roofed had a quarrel with a confectioner. All of the confectioners came to an agreement with the tile maker who was providing tiles for the banker's roof. Hey, tile makers, you can't give that banker tiles until he handles his, the banker has an issue, handles this issue with the confectioner. So it's like these different unions are all like discussing and arguing about like, hey, tile makers, we need you do, and the dentists over here, they need to, you need to pay this guy back. So that's how their society was like organized, is in these like different unions competing for interest. Like, can you imagine a slower, more tough thing to like coordinate all these people to like decide this stuff? Like, wow.
Yeah, here's a quote on what he's calling the weaknesses of Indian politics. Quote, Indian social development outran both political and economic development early on. The subcontinent acquired a common culture under a set of religious beliefs and social practices that marked it as a distinctive civilization long before anyone ever tried to unify it politically. So that's where society is beating state and holding the state down. So it couldn't develop state capacity to unify.
It never got to be centralized. It was so local the whole time, It
did a few times, but it would break apart. This is one of the more unexpected chapter titles, Slavery and the Muslim Exit from Tribalism. So he talks about how basically we've been, China got away from just their kin groups by doing the social service exam. India never quite got away from their entrenched kin groups. And the Muslim societies, which, took over a huge part of the world. So talk about having state capacity. How did they do it? They did it through military slavery. Unbelievable idea. He starts talking about how Muslim societies were initially extremely tribal in the sense of having much stronger social institutions and state institutions. Quote, the Prophet's teachings were in a certain sense deliberately anti-tribal, insofar as they proclaimed the existence of a universal ummah, or a community of believers, whose first loyalty was to God and God's word not their tribe. That's kind of how it was, like 100 years. And he went from a tribe in Arabia to Morocco, Spain, Philippines, something like that. How do you build that state army not solely based on religious feeling? Because you can't get people to feel that religiously right off the bat.
You don't let people have a family. They're military slaves. Quote, the system of military slavery emerged as a brilliant adaptation designed to create a strong state-level institution against the backdrop of one of the most powerfully tribal societies on earth. Here, the Mamluks are slave soldiers. These are types of individuals. They're captured as young boys, ripped from murdered mothers and fathers, converted to Islam, trained as elite warriors. You no longer have a family. Your family is this new military group that you're a part of. Fast forward that story, and you got yourself an elite army tied to you only.
And a bureaucracy, and similar to the civil service exam, is they're promoted based on merit. So it does a really good job of, bringing the military leaders and accountants and whoever, all the positions you need. If you're promoting solely based on merit, because none of them have any family ties because they're all being captured and brought in, that's a good solution to the problem.
I'm equating it to like college football coaches looking around for the best football players across the country and picking the best guys to join their team. But it's like those coaches, 2,000 years ago were Islamic coaches, and they're killing your mom and dad and stealing you to join the team for life. And they're getting all the best guys, football players in the whole country. It's like, you're going to kick everyone else's ass, right?
Until
they rule, well, hold on, but not until. That army that we described is called the Mamluk slave army. They took over and ruled Egypt for 300 years.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, until, because they were the slaves, and then they got so powerful, being the slave military elite, they defeated the Egyptian army and ruled Egypt as their own. But then the elite becomes, you hand down your position to your kids, so they kind of subverted the system. And they started choosing their leaders based on their children and handing it out, doing favors to family members and stuff like that. And so they eventually got defeated by the Ottomans, who were even better at keeping their military slaves in line. It's just a nonstop, military slave elites taking over new military slave elites.
We're now in the 1500s. We're going to go back and forth quite a bit, but we're talking about the functioning and decline of the Ottoman state. So they had a slave army. Fukuyama says the Ottomans were more centralized and impersonal than many European states at the time. Quote, the Ottomans were by far the most successful regime ever to emerge in the Muslim world. They were able to concentrate power on a scale unprecedented for the region on the basis of the institutions they created. But the institution of military slavery that lay at the core of Ottoman power represented a dead end with respect to global political development.
Yeah, dead end. And there's another great history book by friend of the show, Patrick Wyman, great history podcaster. His book's called The Verge, 40 Years That Shook the World. One of the things that stood out to me about that book, it takes place at 1500, and basically Europe sucked compared to the Ottomans. Like, they had more efficient taxes, they were more military efficient, they had better technology. It's just really interesting the extent to which they were ahead of Europe at the time.
Whoa.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a slave military elite eventually turns into a corrupt dynastic elite. That family selection's like gravity. The slaves are eventually, hey, we won the wars, we rule effectively, we should train our sons to do the same. Which is, a decent point. It kind of makes sense, but that's where the rent-seeking and court politics start. You have reversion to the mean, meaning you might have a lot of merit in your position, but your children always revert to the mean. Like, if you're 7 feet tall, your child is probably going to be 6'2", 6'3". They're not going to be 7 feet, So you have reversion to the mean, you have nepotism, giving it to people who don't deserve it. You have the tyranny of cousins, which is a chapter coming up, which is a good chapter title of, you're always doing favors for your families. So all those classic issues plagued the military elites, and they always brought them down in the end.
Bummer.
There's one last side note about the Ottomans, because we talk about how efficient they are, tax collecting. They never developed capitalism. And they never could develop capitalism because their state government, being made up of slave elites, meant that in the social society, the tribes still held on to a lot of power they held on to a lot of social order. So cross-clan trade had a lot of barriers because, you're a Jones, you can't trade with the Smiths. Like, our government might work well, but the general society didn't because they were still so tribal and familial and everything. And so the end result of not developing capitalism, same problem with China, means that the only new resources that most of the new resources come from conquering other people, So the Ottomans conquer, but eventually they come up against people they can't conquer, and then the government starts to fail.
So now we're going to get to Western Europe, and they had a different journey of the state undermining the family. Christianity. That's how that undermined the family quite significantly in Europe.
I mean, just like, wow, the Roman Empire, most powerful empire in Europe, ever existed in Europe, and it turned Christian, with an ethnocentric, monotheistic religion developing, way out on the outskirts of the empire. 500 years after one guy starts preaching about that stuff, it reaches the emperor and he wins a battle and he sees a cross in the clouds. It's like that meme of the tiny domino and the big domino, just the most unbelievable series of events leading up to him being emperor and winning against his nemesis in a civil war. And then he says, on the day before the big battle, he sees a cross of light in the sky. And here's the words, in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, you will conquer.
So he paints the first two Greek letters of the word Christ, who was a poor Jewish carpenter from the hinterlands, right?
That's just
And he says, hey,
bonkers.
everyone, here's our new banner. We're the cross team now, right? And that was in 306. And by the way, Constantine was a Serbian, right? That his army had proclaimed him emperor in 306. Is it because he went with Jesus that he won? Is it because he united his troops behind Jesus? Was he better militarily and Jesus got lucky that, hey, the good guys picked me? All of the above, right? So they win. The empire turns Christian. But don't worry, Constantine he likes the Roman gods. But then another emperor even later fully takes all the Roman gods and turns them all Christian. Dude, and then, what is it? The Council of Nicaea? Was it 318? They said, hey, this is the Bible, by the way. Right after Constantine won that battle. Hey, we got to get this Bible thing sorted out. So,
Skipping ahead 100 years, and our favorite line, thus has it ever been that the empire long united must fall, long divided must come together. And so Rome falls, but Christianity holds on, very coincidentally based in the same city, unique little circumstance.
They took some of that power and they kept it somehow, right?
And basically, I think that combination of thing, that Rome falling and Christianity holding on, is Fukuyama's main point. They created the rule of law because you were able to have a law that is beyond the realm of the monarchs, and was able to subvert the family, which we'll get to.
The key point being here, in Europe, a continent-sized absolutist power never returns, because now there's this Roman Catholic Church that sort of has a different power structure, sort of outside the normal bounds of power.
Yeah, and that's the difference, is that China didn't have a continent-sized absolutist power. This book doesn't focus on geography very much, but there's another book called Escape from Rome that makes the point that Rome not returning is a large part of the reason that Europe developed. Part of the reason is that, Europe is kind of broken up into peninsulas and a lot of mountains and stuff. But another reason, a very interesting one, is that Europe is far away from the steppe. We hear about Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, the Ottomans, the Turkish peoples. All these people are coming from the steppe. And if you are anywhere near the steppe, you better absolutist up. Those countries, Russia, China, the Ottoman Turks, they were all extremely authoritarian because they were up against some of the most powerful tribal peoples who could just, race off into the sunset and raid at will and everything. So that's a big reason that China was always centralized, is because they were always menaced by steppe peoples, and Europe had a little bit more of a buffer.
Dude, what a great quote, the way you put that all together. You better, if Genghis Khan's nearby, absolutist up, bro, right? You need it, right?
You have tiny little divided Westphalian states. We talked about that in World Order. You can't exist as a tiny little state if you got Genghis a few weeks ride away, which is crazy because that, Genghis can ride a few weeks, no problem. I'm sucking my horse's blood. I'm, your women, like.
Dude, we're going to get to it, but the disciples of Genghis, not even Genghis himself, kicked Hungary's ass in like 1216 or something. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, we run over, we kick Hungary's.
Yeah.
We only came back because he called us back for a big meeting. It's like, we were almost going to kick more of Europe. So Fukuyama, going back to Europe and the Catholic Church, he says the Catholic Church is one of the unsung heroes of Western state building. It created laws outside of executive power. Catholicism created a literate elite that didn't have kids. It changed family structure with more emphasis on nuclear family, less on the kin groups, tribal groups, big tribal bands, right? It allowed more individualism, but Christianity didn't start like this, right? And this is a little bit of the battle of, the power of the kings versus the power of Christianity, Jay.
Yeah. In the early Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Emperor could pick popes and bishops. That was kind of the monarch picking the religious elite.
The Pope doesn't pick the bishops, the king does, right?
Yeah,
Holy Roman Emperor.
Just like China's doing with the Dalai Lama, if you heard. They're deciding who the Dalai Lama's reincarnating
Dude,
as.
hot take connection there. Wow.
Isn't that just a crazy, can you see Xi being like, this is the unreal. So the interesting thing is that priests in the early church could marry and have kids, which like a lot of other churches, like the Eastern Orthodox. And then what happened was a little great man theory injected itself. Fukuyama says this Pope that we're going to talk about is as important as Luther for the creation of the modern world. And here's another just absolutely bonkers. Somebody with, the most causality over human history, and he was a monk reading words on a page, 1,000 years after the prophet died. Unbelievable. Pope Gregory VII and his Gregorian reforms in
1075, smack dab in the Middle Ages. This guy, man, did he make waves. Two big things he did. First, he made priests celibate, and that does not have a biblical precedent. This was Pope Gregory VII that said priests can't have kids. We know now why you make a rule that people can't have kids, because then you can't pass your office on to your kids, and that that allows a more impersonal bureaucracy to develop, right?
Mm-hmm. Get the family
the hell out of my state, right? So, Jay, what was the second big Gregorian reform?
Is that the church picks its own bishops, which sets up an interesting narrative. This is kind of the narrative battle of the Gregorian forming. So this guy, Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, is like, that I like picking my bishops. So he's the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of like a patchwork of states in like Lower Germany or something.
Lots of different castles all combined together into one kind of empire. Yeah.
Gregory excommunicates him. So again, this is like 10,070 something. So he excommunicates him from the church. Now all the nobles who didn't like him are like, this is our chance to rebel because, he's been pushed out of the power structure. Henry books it to Italy from Germany or wherever he is. And the Pope makes him wait 3 days in the snow, barefoot. He's like kneeling in the snow, probably just when people are watching, kind of like social media, like, oh, I'll be in the snow during, breakfast and dinner time.
That was publicized back then.
Yeah,
oh, yeah.
Highly publicized. And the Pope is publicizing it. Oh, there's Henry out there in the snow, I'll talk to him when I get to it. So then Gregory lets him in. The guy apologizes. The Pope reinstates him, declares that now the Pope has the power to depose and instate emperors, not just the bishops. So he raised the initial.
Yeah,
bit.
He's like, hey, I am allowed to bless you as the rightful emperor, or they're not. Like,
I'm connected to God.
I got control over that now. Exactly. Yeah.
So Henry still hated it. This is like 20 years later or something. He invaded the Vatican in an army. And he set up an anti-pope, which is an awesome word, by the way. What a unique word. Anti-pope Clement. And Gregory had to flee, but Gregory had an iron will, and the conflict was resolved 40 years later. Wow. Crazy things you don't hear about very much, but basically.
Dude, this is the battle of church and state. This is legitimately what we're talking about, right?
Major precedent setting. And so those are the Gregorian forms. And then he talks about how the Catholic Church allowed the rise of individualism.
So one of the things they did, 1215, they banned marrying your cousin. Fukuyama says one of the most consequential things in history, quote, cross-cousin marriage, adoption, and divorce are all strategies of heirship, managing who your heirs will be, whereby kinship groups are able to keep property under the group's control as it is passed down from one generation to another. Nope. Catholic Church says you can't marry your cousin, and so that whole strategy, checkmate, right? This was the end of the European tyranny of cousins. No more, break up the kin groups. No more big tribes of families. This made Europe more merit and market based because your local clan has less control over you.
It's basically like union busting, like you said, your family's in this guild. This guild controls that market for this whole town or this area, and they get to decide, a lot of anti-market practices there. So once you're apprenticing to whoever you might, be more interested in, or you're taken on as an apprentice because you show merit in that market or craft, the better products start doing better. And yeah, it's very interesting. And it takes such a long time for those, you would never ever imagine, let's ban cousin marriage and then all these other things fall out of it, like second and third order effects, like generations and generations. It's just amazing. What a good thought.
I know, dude, it is. And each one of these sentences, it's like every sentence is like a 300-year trend that we're saying, and this happened. This happened as a long human process over 300 years with all these different people's lives, you know what I mean? But 1215, you ban cousin marriage. He goes, the next couple hundred years, what happened in Europe after that big move? You start to develop more impersonal cultural institutions. You get larger cross-clan trust, less tribal politics, more trade, more professions based on merit, weakening family institutions is good for business, right? Another thing good for business, the church, and another big move by the Catholic Church here, they really strengthened property rights. Another way to wrest control away from kin groups and give it back to the church. And this book, Jay's got a great thesis on sort of how the church took over the management of property rights.
Quote, an emerging capitalist economy in England, Italy, and the Netherlands in the 16th century did not have to overcome the resistance of large corporately organized kinship groups with substantial property to protect, as in India and China. Instead, it took root in societies that already had traditions of individualized ownership where property routinely changed hands between strangers. So I guess why? It's so that they could inherit property, so that the property wouldn't, if you die, it wouldn't
go to your son. It comes back to the church.
Yeah, it was easier, basically.
And that's why, hey, no more sons for you, priests, right? That church is ours. That's our property, right?
Yeah, hit us the next point.
Shout out Catholic Church, one of the first large political institutions to give women property rights. Quote, the church undermined the control of extended kinship groups over inheritance and land by allowing women to inherit property and promoting individual property rights. And quote, this was not for theological reasons. It was for self-interested ones, because when a rich widow dies, the church wants her property back. Don't give it to the kin group. It was her individual, and now it comes back to us, right? Now, dude, fast forward this process of property rights managed by the church comes back to us over hundreds of years. Think of all the land that now the Catholic Church owns, and it becomes a much stronger independent actor than any other religion in society. Huge point here. The reason it can make those social changes is because it's not just a political power. One of the most important sentences of the book.
Yeah, so I think the point being, it's not just a political power, this Catholic Church. Quote, Europe and its colonial offshoots were exceptional insofar as the transition out of complex kinship occurred first on a social and cultural level, rather than on a political one. So what's that mean? It means that a political power can't easily change social institutions. The causality just doesn't seem to go that way. States try to change, and you can have a civil service exam, you can enslave young boys, but the society is still going to be really familial based and, those tight little union groups. Because people, it's gravity, that's just the way we are. And that's why he talks about evolution in the first chapter or so.
Bottom line here, Catholic Church chewed up tribes and spit out Christians. Nice quote there, Jay. You wrote that one.
Yeah, that is a pretty good one. I'm kind of proud of that one.
Listen to this. The German, Norse, Maiar, and Slavic tribes saw their kinship structures dissolve within 2 or 3 generations of their conversion to Christianity. So there you go. That's how Europe and Western Europe sort of got a big advantage over India and China, at least up till today, is they had a social structure outside of the political one that was more adapted and due in large part to the Catholic Church. And that brings us on to part 3, the rule of law.
The origins of the rule of law.
European political development was unique in that it wasn't primarily driven by military power, but the state's ability to dispense justice. So it had fair justice, right? Enforcing laws rooted in local customs and religious ideals. The main point here is that those rules were not created by the states, and this gives the state legitimacy in the eyes of the people. So we all subscribe to the set of these laws.
It feels better to be ruled by somebody if the rules that he's following don't, he didn't make them up himself and he has to follow them too. It's interesting. Right. There's lots of cases. We talk a little bit about Poland, but Poland, they would bring in kings from other nobilities. Like they would bring in like a French duke or something. We got to have a king. We don't want him to be here because we don't want him to be tied into the kinship network. We just want him to enforce these laws that are already existing without the king. Very different. We don't think about it that way, but that's how they did.
We bring in a famous Austrian here. Hello, Austria. Friedrich von Hayek.
Classical liberal. He is the god of all conservatives and especially libertarians in the kind of the dawn of the word classical liberal.
He calls law a, quote, spontaneous order, end quote. He describes it like a bottom-up phenomenon. No one person can wrap their head around all the complexities of society. All knowledge is local. That's cool.
If you listen to Tyler Cowen is one of my favorite podcasters and writers, and he said the single best economic essay is Knowledge and Its Use in Society or something by Hayek. And I read it and it is phenomenal. And it does do a very good job of showing why small government may work, because the government, is making laws and enforcing laws based on information they have about certain, areas. We think this thing's happening. We either want to encourage that or discourage that. But what Hayek is saying is that the information gets lossy all the way at the top. There's so many layers to go through that the people with all the best information is at the very bottom layer. When you're deciding, I'm going to price my bread this way because I want it to do this, or I think this is going to happen, or whatever. So that's basically why communism failed, because, they were trying to bring all the information up to the top and make all the decisions all the way down. And Hayek is like, each person should be making their own decisions, and, markets are a much better mechanism for deciding all of these things. So that's what he means when he says knowledge is local.
Letting millions of interactions play out to find evolutionarily stable states.
Yeah, that was my words. Probably not his words, but good way of summing it up.
Great description of the Hayek stuff. I love it.
So this is best exemplified by the English idea of the common law, where the capital L law is built on thousands of cumulative decisions by lots of judges over many, many years. So it's kind of a bottom-up phenomenon, which is as opposed to Justinian law, which was created by the Emperor Justin, or maybe Justinian. What he did was he's like, okay, we need to have the smartest people look over all the laws that are written and then write them down and codify them, and almost in a legalist sense, I think, code for every possible permutation of, who gets paid this for what, who gets punished, and try to do a top-down thing.
Legalism.
Yeah. And that's the Justinian law, and that's kind of so systematizing it. In English common law, the judges make the law based on precedents. They're like, well, in this situation, the precedent would be, it's kind of subtle. I'm not doing a very good job.
Dude, you had it. English common law is developed based on, you have a case, a judge makes a decision. Other judges in the future will look at the situations, they have a certain case, they look backwards. Did anyone have a case like this before? Okay, that judge made that decision. I think that was correct. I'm going to make the same decision. So it's like it's a garden growing the law versus an architect designing the law.
Yeah.
And that's a cool way to think about it. And that's I'd never heard that English common law thing, and like I was thinking about it as I was reading this, but I'm like, that totally makes sense, and that's kind of how I would want my law to be created. I'm a pro English common law guy now after reading this, because like, yeah, you know, we encounter these questions as we have them, and then like judges who we trust to make rational decisions make the decisions, right?
Rather than they would have a judge in Justinian law would have to reference what law did they break, you know, and so then it gets all kind of Byzantine. How about that? That was who came up with that. Yeah.
So back to what made England special. There was a lot of law systems in the Dark Ages, and thus there was a lot of competition between jurisdictions. Quote, of all European polities, the English state was by far the most centralized and powerful. The state grew out of the king's court and its ability to offer justice across the whole realm. King's court adopted English common law, which already existed when the Normans took over.
England may have never adopted common law when it was ruled by Anglo-Saxon clans, because the common law is kind of an impersonal bottom-up, and the Anglo-Saxons were kind of coming in, and they were like a noble elite, wheeling and dealing with their family members. And so maybe it took a ruling elite with even fewer. I mean, you know, imagine how many, a couple thousand Normans are coming over and ruling over how many millions of people, you know? So they adopted the legal traditions that had already been growing up over 1,000 years or something and said, yeah, those are good. I have this is right up your alley here. The Miles Quaritch. He's the bad guy in Avatar.
Yeah, let me give you this quote. If you guys know what's Miles Quaritch, Avatar, a marine in an avatar body, that's a potent mix. Now we're going to give it to Fukuyama, a common law backed up by an effectively centralized state. That's a potent mix.
That's a potent mix.
If you want to joke about the actual fact of why England was the best, and the best meaning the one that colonized so much more, and obviously eventually, you know,
I think just means having stable political institutions that effectively govern and grow the pie. I forget, you know, it's kind of, we have to reorient ourselves here. We're talking about rule of law, and we just went off on a little tangent about common law and Justinian law.
Yeah, I got your back. The book weaves between the themes of good governance and the historical narratives. And I'm going to bring you back to the historical narrative and talk a little bit more about rule of law, because the church had a huge, now we're not just in England here. Shortly after Pope Gregory sort of grabbed all that power, you guys remember we talked about him, a guy named Gratian. This guy Gratian spends his entire career reading and organizing, summarizing all of the different laws written by all of the different church legal codes that had ever been written, every legal document ever written. And this guy, Gratian, 1140 AD, delivers his life's work titled, incredible title, Concordance of Discordant Canons. I mean,
that sounds like a death metal song.
Dude, it sounds like a Meshuggah song so bad. Yeah. I totally agree, dude. I was thinking that when I wrote it. I was like, probably, Meshuggah's probably inspired. Dude, think about this guy. He read every single legal document that the church had ever put out, and he's like, they all said these different things, and I organized them all into one. It's my life's work, Concordance of Discordant Canons, you know? All the canon of church has been concorded. Here's some church and state. And this chapter, by the way, this part that we're reading, so he's talking about rule of law, but he's also talking about how the church becomes a state. Well, how does the church become a state? It creates laws, right? Have some church and state questions for you here, Jay. You're in the Middle Ages. Literacy rates are probably single digits. Where are you going to get people who know how to read and write? How are you going to create some stability? How are you going to justify all the rules you put on your subjects? You're going to study all the old Roman laws, and you're going to get all these people together in one place to study them.
And write to other people. And yeah, basically the Catholic Church funded the universities. They started the university system, which is a major institution in the rise of Western Europe. Quote, the Catholic Church acquired state-like attributes through its concept of a single canon law, but it also became more state-like by developing a bureaucracy by which it could administer its affairs. So, like, what it's doing is it's training legal experts, you know, separating them from their families in their kin groups, putting them all together in one, group that transcends state boundaries, that transcends family and tribal boundaries, you know, and then sending them all over the continent in order to serve the local monarchs. That's a recipe for success right there. And and that's what's crazy. It's the church is not, thinking, Gregory is not thinking, if I take this away, over 1,000 years, this is going to happen. Everyone's just making, it's the vagaries of historical narrative. And now we got, lawyers who are trained and don't have families traveling all over the continent. Just amazing.
And that's how the church becomes a state and creates a rule of law that was above any one ruler. That's how Gregory can justify picking the emperors, because I got law that's above you, emperor, right? But Jay, do you think the state is going to just sit by and let the church just take its lunch?
No,
hell no, dude. So the state's got to fight back. And so the next chapter in the book, the chapter we just finished, the church becomes a state. The next chapter after is the state becomes a church. Quote, Westerners often think that the fusion of church and state is intrinsic to Islam and foreign to the Christian Europe, and the kind of theocratic regime set up in Iran after the 1979 revolution somehow constitutes a reversion to a traditional form of Muslim rule. None of this is accurate, right? So he's kind of pointing out that Iranian state has become a church, right? And he says, but he's like, in this chapter here, he's like, dude, lots of states steal moves from religions. In the Middle Ages, after the Gregorian reforms, European kingdoms were all run by Catholic law. Jaboy of hammer and nail fame, Martin Luther, he opened up new religious options. And with that, the savvy king saw a way to push back against the Catholic power. Now the military started religious wars, fighting for different religions, because they're like, hey, our religion is right, your religion is wrong. Also, if my religion wins the war, I'll have more power as a king than I would if I was Catholic. The state has now become a church fighting for a religion.
I feel like that's a whole book in its own. Martin Luther, changing things up and kind of subverting a lot of Catholic power. And so, a lot of the monarchs are like, I don't like this organization that I'm in now. I'm going to do blue ocean strategy and start my own Anglican church or whatever. So that's how the state becomes a church. These different monarchs are starting it on their own. So we saw the church established law, quote, one of the peculiar features of European state building was its heavy early dependence on law as both the motive and the process by which state institutions grew. It's kind of a vague quote.
Yeah, let me help you out. In large part to the decentralized nature of Europe at the time, dude, you got all these different castles and religions and Game of Thrones style wars going on. You got Protestants, you got Catholics, you got different groups of Protestants and Catholics. Like, that's how the state becomes the church. I don't know how else to say it.
So he's saying, the interaction between the Catholic Church and the European states was fundamental in shaping Western Europe's political development, where church autonomy is a counterbalance to state power. And this creates lots of institutions, it generates rule of law, and it eventually leads to the rise of secular governance. I think there's just so many, like the 30 Years' War, I think it killed 30% of people in Germany or something like that, just some ridiculous number. And so we're like, whoa, we got to get the states out of the church.
China, India, Eastern Europe, Russia, all of those areas, religion was either dominated by the state or lacked significant institutional power. So, Jay, this was my hot take at the beginning of the whole podcast here. The combination of Catholicism and castles got Europe to the top spot, right? Because all these different castles with all these different warring states and everything, and then you got the Catholic, like, giving you another source of power outside of your sort of military castle power. Dude, Catholics and castles, that's what made Europe the winner.
It's a good visual, and I think the castles are a sign of decentralization, which was necessary for this, because, one of his main points is that you can't have an absolutist power and develop a thriving capitalist economy. But I think the castles are more just correlated, not causing the success. Because actually, I looked it up. Where were the most castles in Europe? Like, where are the highest density of castles? Wales, interestingly, which was a place that, historically was difficult for England to conquer. And another one was Czechia has the highest proportion of castles in Europe. And those are two places that we don't talk much about as the formation point, because castles are a sign of decentralization, but you need a mix is what Fukuyama is saying. And that's why he's so focused on England, because it was kind of small enough to be just a part of a larger network, but it was still very efficiently governed and they had a lot of state capacity.
Yeah. So JD, my Catholics and castles, definitely it rhymes and it's more of a symbol. The symbol of the decentralized nature of Western Europe combined with, a power source outside of the normal state structure, the Catholic Church. That's those decentralization in Catholicism, but Catholics and castles sounds more fun. We're going to go backwards a little bit because we're going to compare. We just mentioned, like Russia, China, religion never dominated the state. And because of this, China never had rule of law. And that's what we're getting into is this rule of law thing. So we're going to show how not having rule of law has hurt China. A huge problem when you don't have rule of law is the bad emperor.
Bad emperor problem. It is the ultimate problem. You can never get past this.
You get a bad emperor and you're screwed. And Jays, you're probably going to talk about this crazy bad emperor, right?
Yeah. This Empress Wu, Fukuyama does a full page on her, and it is just fascinating. She's the only woman in Chinese history to start her own dynasty. She doesn't start it from her husband. She doesn't give it to her son. This woman is a psychopath and probably a high IQ, absolute evil psychopath. So she was a concubine of the emperor. And so how do you subvert the wife of the emperor? What she does to get rid of the wife is that she sets up a meeting with her son and the wife. Then she strangles her son and blames the wife because no mother could strangle their own child. And so the emperor believes her and gets rid of the wife and makes her the wife. And then she strangles 3 more of her own sons. Eventually, skipping ahead 20 years or whatever, she kills all her own children. She destroys the noble class and eventually starts her own dynasty. And she just it's like a bit of pros and cons because getting rid of the noble elites, does some helpful things, but she absolutely destroys the bureaucracy. The chain of command all goes to her lovers. She's just handing it off to her concubines. It was just wild. And unfortunately, future historians are and that's why we can't let a woman get power, because look what happened. She is the craziest emperor and one of the craziest emperors in Chinese history. But that's what happened.
That's crazy. And you said it way better than I could. I saw something in Wikipedia, is she considered, do Chinese people think she's good or bad?
No, she's bad. They think she's bad. Yeah.
I hope so. She consolidated power and added a bunch of new territory. Those are 2 good things. You know what I mean?
Yeah. She did some good, some bad, but I think mostly bad. Murdering son is gray area.
So evil Empress Wu, that's what we'll call her. That's an example of what can happen when the emperor is outside the law, when your society does not have rule of law.
They control the law for their own gain and then give it to whoever they want, because there was nothing above her. She was not Confucian, to say the least.
Yeah. So it can work really good without rule of law, but it can't work forever over time without rule of law. It can't work
forever because 1,000 years after this, another one, there was a Chinese emperor who was a workaholic and he was a micromanager and he banned prime ministers and he banned lots of posts. He banned all the middle management, thinking, I should do all the work. The emperor, I'm the one making all the decisions. Well, it barely worked when the emperor is really smart, really hardworking, probably a little autistic and obsessed. What do you do when you give it to the next guy who's not? That's why the bad emperor problem compounds, because the next guy to get it was kind of an alcoholic musician or whatever. You think that guy's going to do a good job? If there's no middle managers, there's no prime ministers, this guy was getting thousands of letters a day of things that he needed to decide on that the last emperor was doing, that the other guy's in a rock garden chilling with his concubines, So.
Oh my, so bad emperor compounds, nothing political institutions can do about it. Some other force is going to come from the outside to wipe the slate clean. It might be Mongols, it might be Manchurians, it might be the British, it might be communists, it might be anything. But you need rule of law above the king to keep things on an even keel long term.
So, new chapter. This is kind of it's oddly, I don't know exactly where we're going. Stationary bandits. That was kind of the term we used for the rise of states in against the grain. You got a roving bandit, and then they're like, oh, we can just cultivate grain here and take the surplus for ourselves. That's stationary bandits. Fukuyama asks, are all states predatory? And here's a quote. The stationary bandit realizes that if he can become richer by blah, 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 and providing stability and order, I can take the surplus.
Fukuyama drops some really elite intellectual trash talk. We are fans of intellectual trash talk on this show, are we not?
Yes.
He goes, he's talking about stationary bandits, and I just quoted this directly from the book. Quote, stationary bandits, quote, it's a pleasingly cynical concept, but the only problem with the theory is that it is not correct. I do love
the only
that.
problem. Yeah, so understated.
Yeah, exactly, dude. So this part in here, he's like trying to he's going anti, he's an intellectual. He has to counter other intellectuals' arguments he disagrees with. He's going after the stationary bandit concept.
Now I'm thinking about it. I think in the context of rule of law, what he's saying is, yeah, it is very pleasingly cynical. That is a great little phrase to be like, oh, all states are bad and evil and whatever. But he's like, no, the states are up to some pretty good things, and they're are mostly reliant on rule of law for their legitimacy, and a stationary bandit would have no staying power, no stability, which is integral to the definition of state. A state, by some definition, is stable over time.
If you're just a stationary bandit, you're just going to maximize the taxes you can get from your people. And he's like, there's so many rulers that did not do that. And so therefore, this is a pleasingly cynical, but it is not correct, right? So
myth busted.
That's a myth busted. Need rule of law. If you don't have rule of law, you get the bad emperor problem. Empress Wu, particularly bad.
A lot of people would argue Xi is a bad emperor problem. I mean, Belt and Road, sort of a failure. The lockdowns were sort of a failure. The housing crisis. There's been more talk on Twitter of Xi being, a case of the bad emperor problem. And talk about someone who's super consolidating. I mean, power has never been more consolidated since Mao. They're susceptible. They're fragile to the bad emperor problem now more than ever.
Yeah, always. So part 4 of Origins of Political Order, the final cherry on top of making a good society, you need an accountable government. And so we're going to review the rise of political accountability. Of the 3 regions of the world we've been covering, only Europe ended with accountable institutions. He talked about English common law being a big reason England got ahead. This accountable government is a big reason Western Europe got ahead. China, we mentioned earlier, but China had the Confucian norms saying the emperor should be good to the people, but norms don't work with the bad emperor. Islamic world had religious norms about the poor, but I wrote in here, caliph's gonna caliph, again, bad emperor. You have someone who's not accountable. You might have a period where they're not accountable to the people. Neither one of those regions, China or the Islamic world, had political institutions that enforced accountability, Jay.
So what he does here is he cruises through some historical timelines of 4 regions in Europe and sort of traces out how accountable they are, breaks it into 4 categories, like a little matrix. There's absolutist governments, and then there's more accountable oligarchic governments run by sets of nobles. And then there's weak absolutists, who wanted the absolute but are fraying at the edges, and strong ones. So he basically, France and Spain, he says, were weak absolutist empires, where Russia was strong absolutists. And he compares and contrasts. Then he compares and contrasts a failed oligarchy in Hungary and Poland. And then finally, the accountable government, the successful oligarchy or parliament in England and Denmark.
And if you listen to our podcast on Ancient City, which, by the way, you have to, that's one of the most fascinating books we've ever read. This section here, this Western Europe developing accountable government, reads a lot like it's like a rehashing of Ancient City. That story was the story of cities being created. This is the story of states being created. But the same pattern. You have a king, you have rich aristocracy, and you have peasants. And revolutions keep happening, switching who's in power, right?
Yeah, it's like a love triangle. It's very interesting. Like, a lot of times the peasants all band together to elevate one member of the aristocracy to become king, to kind of counterbalance the nobles who are taxing them to death. They're, you're supposed to farm my land and I take however much I want, unless a king comes and enforces laws over the whole land, And sometimes the king is so powerful, you need a bunch of elites able to counterbalance him, And so the peasants are always kind of going between one of the two. And it's very interesting how he traces these out.
And there's only a few places where revolutions stabilized into accountable governments, where revolutions were almost programmed into the governmental system. And dude, this is like the magic of the whole system here. Where you get programmed revolution in your government system, well, England had a way of doing that. It was called Parliament. Quote, the very lateness of the European state-building project was the source of the political liberty that Europeans would later enjoy.
Back to the historical narrative here. They're building castles, they're ruling little plots of land. Landed nobility is entrenched in that land, and they're living in separate castles. They've got their own income, their own military forces. You have a network of those nobles. You put them together, all these people have incomes and militaries and whatever. If they come together and if they start deciding things for the land, that's called a parliament. And every European country had one. It's a holdover, apparently, from the feudal Middle Ages. But here's the thing, like we said, monarchs don't like parliaments. They really, really don't like them. So they want to be in charge. They want to behave like Chinese emperors. And in almost every single European country, the authoritarian monarchy won, except in England. And so this is what we're leading to in the book. You know, we're going through these different countries and why the authoritarian won in every single one except England. So starting in France, we have the Ancien regime, against whom the French Revolution rebelled. The end of the book is the French Revolution. The Ancien regime is who had been in power, you know, the various Louis and all those people. They're broke. They have a lot of wars. They have a lot of fancy court decorations. But the only way they were able to tax people and to run their government was to sell offices to the richest people. That's the main point. Remember, one thing about France and Spain, they were selling office to the highest bidder, and then that office was being handed down to who? Their children. The family was entrenched in that government, and that's why you cannot govern if you're selling your offices, because those people have no desire to do the best for the government. They're just doing the best for themselves.
Yeah, no, you said it well, man. You can't privatize all your core functions to families who buy them, and it won't work.
It's an easy way out. That you could just see him happening, like, sir, like, you know, you see the nervous bureaucrat coming up to the king. We don't have the money. Like, oh, sell this office, you know, sell that office. I just need a little cash, just a taste.
Yeah, dude,
and
love that.
It happens over and over. And yeah, you're toast. Quote, government offices from military commands to positions in the finance ministry to tax collection were sold to the highest bidder. Government, in other words, was privatized down to its core functions. Basically, that's the social order, the family infesting itself into the state.
And eventually, a core group of young Parisians absolutely hated the government, and somehow, and this is another story, they initiated the French Revolution and sort of turned that whole thing on its head.
Well, it shows too. So what the state was doing is he's consolidating power, and he's getting rid of nobles and fuck these nobles and selling states, and you're kind of like ripping up the state a little bit and collecting as much of it as you can in Paris, and which makes it easy to take over because you got a few thousand police or military there, but they don't care about it because their general just bought his position or got it from his father or whatever. So nobody really cares very much. And if you've got a highly motivated group of young, absolutely bonkers people, the ideas they had were out of control nuts,
And they just sponsored the American Revolution 20 years ago. They're like, that was pretty cool. Let's do our own, right?
Yeah.
So there's that too. So
yeah,
France and Spain, the weak absolutists. They had weak kings. Let's get to Spain. Spain was governed like absolute trash. JD wrote that. Sorry, Spanish. They borrowed instead of taxed, declaring bankruptcy multiple times a century. They transferred that same governing system to the Americas, and that's, a whole nother story. He goes to a lot about how Spain kind of screwed over Latin America and South America. Just like in France, back in the home country, offices in Latin America were auctioned off. So if you bought the right to collect taxes on an area, your accountability to the government is over. You could take whatever you want, however you want. And today, that pattern running over generations, as Fukuyama says, that's why Latin America ranks among the most highly unequal societies, because they were just basically, you bought the right to tax a certain area and then you are the king of that area, no accountability whatsoever.
Yeah. That was weak absolutism. Now he goes to weak oligarchy. Hungary apparently had a limited monarchy, just like in England. And we never knew about this. Not long after the Magna Carta was signed, which hot take was overrated, but that's another podcast. In the 1200s in Hungary, a similar pact was signed, taking legal control away from the central government and returning it to the elites. But quote, liberty was not sought on behalf of the whole realm, but rather on behalf of a narrow oligarchic class that wanted to use its freedom to squeeze its own peasants harder.
And that, by the way, that sort of Hungary's Magna Carta was called the Golden Bull. That was the name of that thing, by the way.
A cooler, name. Pretty cool name.
Way cooler than Magna Carta, for sure.
So we're getting back to Hungary, but the squeezing the peasants harder was a good part to introduce the big difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, which was serfdom. Serfdom went away in Western Europe while it continued in Eastern Europe after the Black Plague. Why? Simple answer being that Western Europe was more urbanized. Quote, the existence of urban centers developed their own resources independent of the manorial economy, must be related to the word manor. The existence of free cities in turn made serfdom increasingly difficult to maintain. So somehow Western Europe was more urban. People couldn't have as much control over the land in Western Europe. But what this does is if you have more urban societies, that also raises the price of grain because you're making lots of crafts, you're developing the economy. Those people have more money. They need food. Nobody's growing the food in that area because they're all working on their crafts or whatever. So now you're increasing the price of grain, which incentivizes the elites in Eastern Europe to tighten down control, which is what the Golden Bowl did. Because, they took power away from the king because the king was probably going to equalize them and kind of, institute rule of law over the peasants, saying, hey, you can't beat a peasant, all this kind of stuff. So they took that power away because they were making so much money selling grain to Western Europe.
But unfortunately for those Hungarians, the nobles sort of over-limited the king's power, and they prioritized their own privileges over national defense. And what does that result in? Getting their ass kicked by the Ottoman Empire, right? So they over-limited, and there was no single person. There's no big central military. Again, the military, right? And that happened, by the way, multiple times in the history of Hungary. First, it was the Mongolians in 1241, and then it was the Ottoman Turks in 1526.
The Hungarians speak Uralic language. Hungarian is like totally unrelated to any other European language because people called the Magyars or the Magyars or something invaded, I don't know, a few hundred years before Genghis too. So yeah, for some reason, Hungary's been defeated over and over and it was never centralized enough. Which is why I make the argument that castles aren't enough, because castles are a sign of decentralization, but then you get beat by Genghis or the Ottomans.
And a great quote from Fukuyama in here on this chapter, quote, freedom is lost not when the state is too strong, but when it is too weak.
So he compares it to Poland, which he focuses mostly on Hungary, but Poland is another very similar circumstance. I mean, as we know, Poland was kind of divided up between a bunch of countries, but like, in the 1500s or something, Poland was the superpower. It was the largest country in Europe. And interestingly, it was much more democratic than England, that more people could vote, more people were involved in the governing of Poland, but it was too decentralized and those people couldn't coordinate. And they eventually got beaten by the Prussians and the Russians, which brings us on to Russia, a case of strong absolutism.
In a lot of the Western states, the king allies with the people against the nobles, like a balancing act. In Russia, the king relied on the nobles to control the people, which all that does is increase serfdom over time. But in Russia, the king eventually f***ed over the nobles. So now he's got everything. So, and we mentioned this earlier, Russia, you can't underestimate it, is steppe adjacent. So
steppe adjacency is a big red flag for stable institutions.
In your geography, yeah. And people in Russia still like talk about 1200s when the Mongolians took them over. Like that's like in the history of their country, that's like we can't let that ever happen again.
So the Kievan Rus were kind of the first, that's where the Rus is where the Russia comes from. And that was a state power located somewhere in Ukraine, which is why Putin made the argument that, Ukraine has always been a part of Russia or whatever. Moscow only became big once Genghis Khan defeated the Kievan Rus and made Moscow the center of power, and he made it a puppet state. So it's called the Duchy of Muscovy. But that was the puppet state that Ugadai or whoever would rule through. Those were the people in Moscow. And so they kind of took that governing style of absolute authoritarianism, and they've been running with it for 1,000 years, close to.
Quote, Russia prior to the Bolshevik Revolution had developed a strongly centralized state in which executive power was only weakly constrained by either rule of law or accountable legislatures. How is a state going to let itself be constrained by an older legal tradition when the state was set up by the Mongol Khans? Great way to summarize it, dude.
Yeah,
right?
It's like that letter from the Pope to Genghis Khan, like, our God and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, well, your God seems to be losing. So, I don't know why you're referencing him so much.
Dude, you gotta love that story.
You gotta love that, dude. Unbelievable.
That letter to the Pope. So what about the church? Why didn't that establish legal norms like it did in Western Europe? The Russian Orthodox Church, as its name implies, was much more tightly folded into serving the state, thanks to Peter the Great. Unlike in Western Europe, the church served just one state rather than a dense fabric of states, Russian Orthodox Church. And also, quote, in the West, the Catholic Church played a role in state building by creating a class of educated clerics who could administer laws and institutions.
That was a big thing that we talked about, how the church makes a state. They set up these institutions and then dispersed them all over the continent.
Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, was much more focused on the rituals than creating the class of educated clerics. And that was a very breezy summary, but we're just hitting you with some of the major highlights before moving on to England. So we've hit weak absolutism, we've hit successful absolutism, we hit weak oligarchy, that was Hungary, and now we're going to get accountable government, England, right?
Well, yeah, actually, just this tiniest side note, because I saw the most cool historical painting. There's another city that was a rival power of Muscovy in the 14 or 1500s or something called Novgorod. And that was like a big center of power. It's north of Moscow. That was a possible, center of state building there. And that was kind of democratic. They would vote in, the governor of Novgorod or whatever. And Muscovy, they had a huge civil war between those two, and Moscow won, which shows that, the decentralization doesn't always work because you're always, some neighbor is going to be on a conquering spree somewhere. And, it was this really cool painting. It was like, apparently the bell of Novgorod was a famous, maybe when they elected people, they rang the bell or whatever. And this painting was like 15 feet long. And it showed the Muscovy people, like, the bells on the ground, everyone's weeping, there's dead bodies everywhere. And like, the Stalin-like figure is standing over. And I'm like, that, talk about pivotal historical making moments right there, is when Moscow wins and, changes the game. Because Napoleon might have won, speaking of absolutist power, if it weren't for Moscow. And
yeah, you have to have decentralization, like figure out the best system, but then at the right time, you need enough power to keep it together. You know what I mean?
That's well said. There is a right time. There is definitely a time when you need power.
So let's get to England. And you know what? This is a book on political institutions. So we're not going to mention that England was an island and had the best navy, and that, was a big part in why it conquered the world. We're going to look back on, what developed and allowed it to have a great navy and a cohesive social order.
Taxation and representation. In contrast to absolutist France, Spain, and Russia, the English Parliament was a strong, cohesive institution, which involved a larger chunk of the population than most countries did.
In contrast to Hungary and Poland, the parliament represented not just the elites, but townspeople and lowly landowners. So there you go. It represented a bigger percentage of the people. Grassroots political participation was a bigger part of English culture.
I say it's probably from the Danelaw, because a lot of people were colonizing England, and I think the Danelaw were from the Danish people that were coming, and I kind of think that might be the origins of common laws from the Danelaw.
Ooh, interesting. The Danes getting their way in there. Love that. Elites were more fluid, less locked in over generations. Nobody owned the cities.
Serfdom couldn't take root in Western Europe because the cities were so independent. You couldn't rule over a city, and so that helped England too.
And political solidarity was reinforced by aforementioned English common law, right? Provided property owners with strong legal protections. Quote, the common law and English legal institutions were broadly regarded as legitimate and gave property owners a strong stake in defending them.
The church started enforcing property law and property rights in order to take some when people would die, and the church could inherit, law or whatever. And it sounds like England was kind of ran with it more than most other societies, more effectively against the state too, or the state sort of was able to weave itself into the already existing laws of the land, and then be seen as legitimate by the people because they weren't kind of around and just doing things for themselves.
So Adam Smith jumps in the fray a little bit. He had an argument that independent cities in particular were essential to the rise of a strong bourgeoisie.
Yeah, you needed lots of immigration into the cities in order to maintain a city because everybody that moved to the cities dying at a higher rate. Which is kind of an interesting thing to think that the engine of our, the eventual economic pie growing was killing a lot of people at the beginning.
So the magic here in England is definitely the parliament and the social role that it played. And it had such a key role in developing the system of taxation that people thought it legitimate and made the system fairer and more efficient. The largest part of the tax burden fell on the relatively wealthy individuals. Sounds pretty good. Until we get to James II. This was a devout Catholic king in a Protestant country. He started suspending the laws for Catholics, overruling Parliament, and trying to be basically a Catholic Chinese emperor, a Catholic version of a Chinese emperor. So look at this one, 1688, Glorious Revolution. Parliament rounded up some military and fought a civil war with James II. They replaced the Catholic king with a Protestant king only if he accepted a Bill of Rights. Little foreshadowing for you.
Little foreshadowing.
It also helps out that your boy John Locke was on the boat bringing in the new king. Dude, John Locke just nailing the timing on that one,
Yeah, really.
And while he was on the boat bringing in the new king, he was also writing his second treatise on governing. Fukuyama likes Locke quite a bit. Quote, Locke provided a normative justification for political accountability, arguing that legitimate authority was rooted in the consent of the governed.
We've heard that phrase before.
Dude, legitimate authority was rooted in the consent of the governed and that governments existed to protect individuals' rights to life, liberty, and property.
More foreshadowing.
100 years after that, Americans start the same stuff. So, good job, Locke. You definitely were right there. England and then America really are the only two places where the authoritarian side of the equation in this Civil War battle lost. Question, why didn't radical authoritarians take over after the Civil War? Answer,
quote,
there was far more solidarity among key social groups in England to protect their rights against the king than there was elsewhere. They got this long history, end quote. They got this long history of these parliaments. We work together, we vote, we agree. It has some sort of process. We all believe in this system of parliament. And so we had better social groups than anyone else.
Yeah, The king's legitimate because he's under the law and we have a hand in creating the law and he's listening to us through the parliament. And so it's kind of an equal balance of social order, civil order, religious order. The religion is kind of tied into the state, but it's sort of separate from the state in a way. So I think it's kind of this conglomeration of subtle differences that make England, helps to have coal, helps to be an island, but eventually leads to the Industrial Revolution. And that's basically the book.
Political institutions that have rule of law, accountability, and state capacity, those ones are the winners. And a lot of history dictates where you get those three categories lining up. Quote, societies do not get to sweep the decks clear in every generation. New institutions are typically layered on top of existing ones, which survive for extraordinarily long periods of time. End quote.
That's why it focuses so much on history in the book, because all these institutions are coming out of history and you can't just create them out of nothing, So it's kind of like the book doesn't really have a lot of advice because what do? If you're a country that doesn't have good institutions, you wanted good institutions 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, you know?
And so, hey, the title of the book, The Origins of Political Order. Well, it's a long story of many of the major countries that make up the political order of today. But if you want to boil it down to principles that you should follow, a little recipe for success of your state, you need three things. You need state capacity, you need rule of law, you need political accountability. We're going to hit them to finish it out because this is the book. State capacity, ability of government to enforce laws, maintain order, provide public services, and defend a nation. A strong state is characterized by centralized, efficient bureaucracy that operates effectively and with authority.
And is separated from the family, which is sort of why it's centralized and efficient and effectively operating. Number two, the rule of law means that both the government and the governed are subject to a set of established laws that are applied fairly and consistently, limits the arbitrary exercise of power by rulers, and guarantees that legal norms are upheld by independent institutions.
And number three, political accountability involves the mechanisms that ensure leaders are answerable to the people they govern, whether through democratic elections, checks and balances, other forms of oversight. It requires that rulers act in the interests of the public and are constrained by institutional frameworks that prevent the abuses of the power. Political systems can vary in their balances and their characteristics, but the interplay between them determines the nature of governance and political stability in different societies.
It's a pretty fun book. I would say, wouldn't you agree that the historical aspects are pretty fun to like cruise through thousands of years of different cultures' history and stuff?
We really have a taking, a liking, an affinity for these like sweeping histories. And
everybody loves
every one of them takes a different lens on it. And like, you know, you got sort of you got the guns, germs, and steel lens. You know them better than me, but this one's definitely got sort of like a political institutions lens.
Yeah, exactly.
And
so
with
that's why
it's very unique, very interesting, definitely very thoughtful. Like, you know, it helps you kind of remember sort of the fundamental characteristics of what makes a good government, right? Like it's kind of like that.
Yeah, I never would have imagined the Catholic Church would play such a big role too. That was a huge eye opener, and the ways the second and third order effects of religious decisions shake out through hundreds of years of society's interplay. And
we even skipped a little bit more on religion from the beginning, and maybe we shouldn't have, but that's he talks so much about how religion is the uniting force for these bands and tribes, and like eventually it keeps becoming a religion, becomes a more uniting force all the way up to the Catholic Church. It's still like doing a uniting job. You know, very cool to see that kind of how religion affects everything.
Yeah, exactly. You need someone to transcend both the social order and something that transcends the civil order. You can't get these social changes from the top down. They need to be kind of bottom up religious decisions about how to not marry your cousins. So those are the only ways to introduce free markets to get the family out. So we talked about progress studies from a geographic lens, which was Guns, Germs, and Steel. We just talked about it from a political institutions lens, Fukuyama. And then I think the next book I'm working on the outline now is for The Weirdest People in the World, which talks about it through a cultural lens. I feel like this book kind of trails off around, 1700. And that book kind of really starts picking up steam around then. When these cultures, the new Western European, highly individualistic culture starts developing. So that'll be a cool final answer to why, that this book gives us good institutions, and that book gives us the framework and the thought processes and the culture that creates, science and art and a lot of new things like that.
Incredible stuff. Thank you, Francis Fukuyama.
Thank you, Francis. Great. Yeah, that was a great book.
You call him Yama. I was calling him Fukitown when I was reading it,
Yeah. He has some good lectures too. He's a really good speaker. Also, this book is well written. The quotes this was a fun book to quote. Some books we do, you gotta kind of pick and choose. This was a well-written book. Definitely worth reading.
He's a clear writer. And a clear speaker too. So check him out on YouTube. Thank you, Fukitown.
Yeah. Thank you, Yama.
Thank you for tuning into Books Brothers. And if you like that show, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. please, it helps us so much. We have so much new, interesting content on the way that we have in the bank. We put out clips and long episodes all at the same time. If you can't handle 3 hours all at the same time, you might discover a book that could change your life. Subscribe to us at Books Brothers on YouTube.